clears it. But here, notice that in the end, they still do not focus their arguments on on what the cost of focusing on this motion in the long term. So before I move on to my rebuttals, I want to discuss here in characterization. Let's see how this motion is gonna work in here. Economic and social crisis here in developing countries is more important for us as a developing nations to focus, because in here developing nations is a nations where they are still very vulnerable to the economic and crisis that will come. The problem here when they are faced with climate change is that both of these problems will occur at the same time. Otherwise, this motion will not happen. So here we are forced to fix a problem to focus on first in order to solve it better. But here, why does focusing on economic and social crisis is better? Because if we focus on the environmental issue first, we fix our environment, but it hurts our potentials in the economic sector in the long term, making our development as a country to take longer and harder time to be a developed country. So here, wait, it is in this motion, it is actually a trade-off upon which how can we fix it. Here, focusing on economic and social crisis is actually better, because by fixing our economies, we open more funds to be later allocated to climate change and fix it later on. So why this is better is that by doing this, we help our citizens and later on have more funds to be allocated to the climate change, rather than just allocating our limited funds right now to solve climate change right now, upon which the effects will not be as big as the when the later situations, when we are good and when we are better in economic situation. So now we're moving on to my rebuttals first. From the first speaker of OG. OG here says that climate change is affecting society directly, but notice maybe true, but notice here panels is that the problem in that what they say is that economic and social crisis theory will actually affect the citizens more. But wait. And the second, OG here also says that the funds here in the first speaker is not really clear. The mechanization is still unclear in their side. And in the for the second speaker of OG says here that the economic sector is flexible enough to allow focusing our funds to climate change. This is not very much not the case. Why? The technology to do climate change in this motion is actually very expensive. The problem in that is currently compounded in our motion is that the problem in the developing nation is that the citizens in their nation is uneducated enough to do the climate change efficiently. This is not eventually something that we can do in this current situation that will make the climate change be solved in the short term. That is the goal of the government in here. Second, OG says that most of it will be used to climate change, like in disaster relief and etc. Here, we acquiesce, we agree, but only to mitigate the effects. Notice here that to change the climate change in our nation, a policies that in the long term will be needed more, upon which, if allocating funds to help in this motion in the short term, the reality is that you still focus on climate change to solve it later. If you focus on mitigating relief, is not gonna solve the climate change in the long term. Notice here that this long term is what we propose as the opposition in this debate. So now moving on to my arguments slash extensions to my first. Why is it better to focus on fixing climate change by gradually doing it? Not yet. By gradually doing it right now rather than instantly doing it in this motion. One, here we see the problem is that if we focus on making this motion on making the policy in this motion happen, we are on the risk of endangering our nation's economic potential and stability in the long term. This is bad. Why? Because without both of these things, our policy of focusing to fix climate change in this situation will not be sustainable without the funds or the focus of our citizens in order to fix this issue later on. Second, what our citizens here will be looking at when they are faced with this economic issue is that how they will get the money to buy foods and other essentials. Here, they will not be focused on fixing their environmental problem, because if they do not have the means to live their life, then why do you care about your environment then when it is not affecting you directly anyway most of the time? So here, focusing on gradually changing it, making us have the stability and fund secure to do it in a way that is sustainable in the long term. But first, yes, POI.
If it is hard to build green technology, most likely government will try to fix better waste management because that is most feasible. Social and economic crises happen because of environmental issues, since these countries get highly impacted by it. So why don't you fix the environmental first? Because like the reason why people cannot buy foods because their crops are dying because of floods or like summer.
The problem in that situation is that the uneducated workforce is not educated enough to make situations and technologies that is needed to change that problem in the first place. The problem is that in your situation is that if you focus on like focusing on climate change, you basically neglected the economic potential and the potential of your citizens in the long term. Now, I really explained it why in my second argument and extensions to my first. How is doing economic and social crisis here is going to help us on the long term? A few reasons. One, it allows us to strategically divert the funds in order to help our citizens. We're in here to help mitigate the problem that is happening in our nations, so that in here our potentials for the future in our economies and by utilizing the potential of our resources will actually lead to a better life for our citizens, whereupon education in our nations will also be improved in the end of the day. Here it actually plays to our advantage because in here improving education also help people to understand why we need to fix this climate change in the first place. This is exclusive on our side. They are more aware of what's happening in the world where they live on. They knows the problem and can act more upon it by the principle from their heart, from the education that they have been taught. So here, rather than forcing them by allocating funds that is taken from them to do something in a problem that is not what most of the people will be thinking about, like in this motion, here, this argument also connects to my first speaker, whereupon by gradually improving our nations, it also helps to make climate change solving solutions become much cheaper. Because in here, our citizens is actually more educated, and our workforce becomes the one that is actually taking on the action to combat climate change. And here, it will make them understand the gravitas of their situation, whereupon it will make the message of climate change be much more felt in our citizens in our situation rather than in the government situation, which is by educating our workforce first. We also link back to my first speaker arguments, where in here the conflicts that will exist that in the first place by in this motion will be non-existent, because the in here the resistance will most likely come from the people that supports climate change if their government do something not aligned with climate change narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, we are proud to oppose this motion. Thank you. God damn.
Thank you so much for the fine speech. Just a quick reminder for you guys, be mindful of your timekeeping because I will not be writing anything that you are talking except 5 to 20 seconds.